morning, everyone. I'm Mackenzie Babb, External Affairs Director for the Kenan Institute of Private Enterprise, and I'm so happy to welcome you all with us today. This marks our fourth in a series of news briefings that we've hosted on the business and economic ramifications of COVID-19. We've shared some really harrowing facts and statistics and data to date, all of which needs to be shared, but I'm happy to say that today we're going to be looking at the other side of this story, the folks who are seeing this crisis as an opportunity to get creative and to innovate and to inspire hope. So I know we've got some familiar faces with us today, but for those who are new, I'm going to quickly run you through how this conversation will go. I'll hand things off here shortly to our panelists, each of which will self-introduce and provide a bit of analysis and insight during the first half of the webinar, and then we're going to move in the second half, right around 11:30, to Q&A. So for reporters who are joining us by webinar, you are welcome to submit your questions to me anytime using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. As a reminder, all participants are muted for the duration of the call, so you'll submit all of them through that Q&A function. And for reporters who are joining us by phone, you are welcome to submit your questions directly to me via email. I think you've all got my email address by now, but for those who need a refresher, it is Mackenzie, MACKENZIE _Babb, BABB, at Kenan-Flagler.unc.edu. And again, you can submit those anytime you'd like. And I'll be moderating the second portion of the call and sharing your questions with our panelists. So with that, it is my pleasure to hand things over to our first speaker, UNC Kenan-Flagler Business School Professor Mahka Moeen. Mahka?
And in the next couple of minutes, I'm going to share with you a couple of ways in which I think the COVID-19 crisis has the potential to shape the innovation and entrepreneurial landscape in the US and global economy in temporary ways and potentially in permanent ways in the coming years. So what are those 5 areas? The first one is that, as we're seeing, there is a race to find a cure or a vaccine for this viral disease. And one way in which governments and nonprofits are motivating such a search for vaccine is to define grand challenges that bring together a large number of actors so that they can all contribute different knowledge pieces that they have so that cumulatively they can add up and really identify the solution. So the reason I think this can have potential innovation ramifications goes beyond the mere identification of a vaccine, which is really the hope and objective here. But when we think about ways in which knowledge is generated, we can always use this analogy of social distancing. Like, think about how everybody is encouraging us not to hang out together and not to form groups. The reason of which being that, hey, if you hang out together, you're going to transmit those viruses that you potentially have to each other. And then there will be an exponential growth rate in disease. Now, a similar mechanism works for knowledge as well, when as innovators and inventors collaborate and exchange knowledge with each other. When they interact, each small piece of knowledge that each of them have will add up into a greater cause, a greater solution. And once these actors get together, the knowledge solutions that are found go beyond the vaccine or a cure for this particular disease. Partners and actors who would not have otherwise collaborated or engaged in knowledge exchange with each other will come together. The second way in which there could be changes in the knowledge landscape pertains to the shortage that we're seeing with respect to medical equipment and PPE. You hear that manufacturers that might not have necessarily been active in the medical sector are now trying to reorient the assets, the factories that they've had in order to produce some of those necessities. But this doesn't mean that what you're going to do is just to duplicate the machines that they've had. You're going to build a very similar factory to what, let's say, GE Healthcare or Medtronics had before. there is going tons of process innovation to identify ways in which you can perhaps produce some of these devices much cheaper, in a quicker way, maybe substitute some of the components that used to go into these products, or even change the entire manufacturing processes. Once you identify some of those process innovations and changes, those car manufacturers who may now produce ventilators can use that knowledge spillover into the old way of business that they were doing. Medical device companies can learn from some of these innovations, and they will not go back to the old inefficient ways of doing business. They will incorporate many of these innovations. So there are going to be long-term spillover effects from there. The third innovation effect that's probably impacting all of us in our life, and it's actually why we're having this webinar instead of an in-person press briefing, is the social distancing guidelines. Social distancing guidelines are changing the demand and supply requirements in a huge number of ways, meaning that we're having like virtual conferencing, using more and more home entertainment, online education, online delivery in goods and services have really accelerated. And these were all caused by this immense demand that we now are all facing. But from perspective of companies, in order to address that huge demand, all of these companies are going to innovate extensively, and those innovations will stay with them. There is also another aspect to it, in that many customers who before this crisis were hesitant to sign up for an online class, who were hesitant to get an online delivery of their groceries, may suddenly like this. So the rate of customer adoption after the social distancing guidelines are removed may remain as high as they are right now. And that shares a lot of informative cues and signals for companies that want to introduce new products in this area. What used to be a very, very small niche of new product innovation now expands into the whole US population. And the fourth phase is that, as much as this is very sad that we're seeing a large number of startup companies going out of business and potential layoffs that are happening in a large sector of the economy, one result in entrepreneurship and innovation research has been the case that entrepreneurs who are potential entrepreneurs who are currently employed in a company may not devote enough of time and attention to those ideas that they have. They may never find the time to pursue that passion, and it always takes 5 to 6 years for entrepreneurs to really refine and polish their ideas. This time that they now have at home has the potential to make them very successful garage entrepreneurs who can later, after the crisis, the economic crisis are over, get the resources that they need and come back to business. So these were the brief ideas I wanted to share with you, and I look forward to the Q&A.
I just wanted to share and underscore some of Mahka's comments on how innovation's been spurred by this crisis. I found that entrepreneurs lead in a crisis. I saw the same phenomenon in 2009, where things were uncertain. Entrepreneurs are accustomed to uncertainty. As a consequence, they jump in and make a major contribution to finding solutions in really novel ways. They dig in and lead in a crisis. Has something to do with how entrepreneurs really give themselves permission and seek to make a difference in times of uncertainty. Entrepreneurs are certainly accustomed to uncertainty, as that's their field of play. They're masters of change. Uncertainty and crisis brings all of our entrepreneurs out on the field. I saw the same surge or movement during the 2009 crisis, but this crisis is very different. It's both unique and it brings about asymmetries that we've never experienced before. We've all been experiencing over-demand and under-supply. Many ventures that I'm interacting with now are working beyond their capacity 2 to 3 times. Their capacities are stretched beyond their limits, while, as Mahka had mentioned, many others are in distress. As you No, UNC has been committed as a public university since its beginning. We have the motto, by the public, for the public. We're really committed to being part of the solution in times of crisis, and we really need entrepreneurs now more than ever to make a difference. We promote that culture of collaboration through our work, as well as the way we've trained entrepreneurs. So I lead the Entrepreneurship Center. We have a basic concept that we use as a rubric for our training: learn, launch, lead. Learn is obviously our pedagogy. Launch is our hands-on entrepreneurial experience. But lead is the most important one, because we recognize that entrepreneurs do focus during these times on trying to figure out ways they can make a difference. They are very accustomed to trying to understand and solve complex problems, and they basically hack solutions. They come up with solutions that are very novel. This course that I teach, for instance, Entrepreneurship Leadership Lab, we instill in that class a sense of leadership, and these are the characteristics we are generally trying to instill in our students: grit, resilience, creativity, adaptability, failure, courage, and passion. These are all words that you associate with entrepreneurship. But what might surprise you is that while many of us have celebrated an entrepreneur's sense of independence, I believe entrepreneurs are more committed to interdependence. They take responsibility to those around them and in their ecosystem. This goes way beyond just the employee relationship and their customers. What we're talking about is the ecosystem of people they're trying to influence change. They're drawn ultimately to the problem, trying to solve that problem, and engaging an ecosystem of people in a common effort to attack it. So they direct their focus on complex problems and find myriad solutions to attack on all levels. You can think of them almost like an army of individual leaders who take action, but they don't wait for permission. They don't wait for orders. They give themselves permission to act, and they do. It has something to do with the gumption that's tied to entrepreneurship. You know, I can give you examples, and I've been on the phone for the last 2 weeks with many of the entrepreneurs who have come out of UNC and have spun out of UNC. Give you one example. Oker is the founder of a company called Kiona Health, and it started as an entrepreneurial initiative during a pretty certain time, a pretty reasonably regular type of experience that we've had in the economy. But now he is redeploying the assets of his company, Kiona Health, to help provide triage systems for clinics, for patient communication, and to elevate cases appropriately. We have several examples like this, and we can probably pick them up in the Q&A, of entrepreneurs who are redirecting their efforts to address the needs of the COVID crisis and the people around us. But I'm really pleased now to transition to 2 stories of how UNC is directly impacting the current situation in a very positive way, and entrepreneurs who motivate them ultimately to address unique challenges that COVID has now given us. First is Professor Rich Superfine, who's chair of our Department of Applied Physical Sciences, who's hacking a solution to the limited supply of medical face masks given their production in China, and redeploying the production assets of our makers' facilities on campus to help solve the paucity of that product being available. And a student of ours who's in my class now, Diana Lee, who's attacking the desperate isolation that we all face, as we're at home, brought about by COVID, particularly among the elderly, many of whom are relegated to nursing home settings or assisted living facilities, and actually combining them with students to help create social bonds that would support them. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Rich Superfine.
The involvement of my team started about 4 weeks ago when looking at the national landscape for personal protection equipment, or PPE, it became clear that there was a need for communities and for technology enterprise, including engineering departments and makerspaces, to get involved in supplying the needs of the healthcare providers. My story personally began 3 weeks ago when I was awakened from my Saturday slumber by Carol Lewis, who leads a task force in the UNC Health. And her charge was to ensure that the PPE for the UNC healthcare was met by potentially by homemade personal protection equipment. So that with that, I joined the task force that's led by Carol in the health system, and the response has been a flurry of meetings of people, of organizational challenges, of innovation around forming teams, processing information, and taking on large-scale challenges that I think none of us had anticipated before, including, for example, using our makerspace to produce 40,000 face shields for the UNC health system. We've been meeting, for example, daily at 2 p.m. with a cross-university team that's included NC State University and UNC, looking at the healthcare needs daily, looking at a dashboard of what are the usage patterns within the hospital, what's in the warehouse, what's coming, and looking really at the redlined items where the need was the highest priority. And looking at that, we've had to generate responses everywhere from engineering new solutions, landing Grace at North Carolina State University, and a variety of other professors over there have done a fantastic job, to producing items like that you hear about in the newspaper, like facial masks, N95 masks, or the face shields that my own group is producing. So when I look at innovation, how it's played a role in what we've done, it's included everything from organizational innovation, information processing innovation, all the way down to technical innovation. From the standpoint of rapidly forming teams, it's been an extremely entrepreneurial activity. We formed teams from that have included Duke, UNC Charlotte, North Carolina State University. It's involved the nonprofit sector. It's involved Blue Cross Blue Shield, for example. I think I've met 15 state government representatives over the last 3 weeks in understanding how we're going to coordinate community response, procurement of PPE by the state, and distribution of innovation that happens within the university. With regard to one of the things I've been fascinated by is the innovation we've had to apply to how we process information. Within our enterprise in our makerspace Beam, we've had to establish procurement procedures, mobilize volunteer bases, set up procedures for manufacturing of these 40,000 face shields, all the while following CDC guidelines and other evolving guidelines about the science and the healthcare around the virus. So it's been astonishing to me at how we are modifying, for example, whether our volunteers wear face masks in the production facility, which they do, social distancing within our facility, which they do, and that those guidelines are coming out really in the newspaper on a daily basis. But that's the kind of information which our group has to constantly vet and stay on top of, which is very different than the environment that happens in a typical company, healthcare technology company setting. The other thing I just wanted to quickly describe was the need for continued investment by the state in the technology enterprises of our great universities. I think it's part of kind of a public understanding that we have to have a diversified manufacturing base to satisfy the needs of the country in, for example, a wartime footing. But that also occurs at a very local level within the state and the manufacturing base of the state. We've had to draw on that throughout our development of our technologies in getting to very companies that have technologies and manufacturing base here in the state to address what's happening very locally. But a lot of the innovation is coming out of the universities in generating the needs of the healthcare system. We are kind of the first line of go-to for the work that has to get done. And it's really been the abilities that we've developed in people, organizationally, and in equipment that has allowed us to generate this response. So with that, I'll turn it back and look forward to answering questions.
Hello, everyone. As Ted was saying, my time in his class and my time in the Adams Apprenticeship has really inspired me to create change in a way that's meaningful to me, but has also stressed upon me the power and the importance of making connections. And those are the principles in which the Phone a Friend program was born. So my name is Diana Lee. I am a third-year Pharm.D candidate at the Eshelman School of Pharmacy. I'm a 2019 Adams apprentice. I'm a former Teach for America teacher, and I lost both my dad and my grandma last year. So I think a lot about our older population, and I've been thinking lately a lot about the loss of connection and how profoundly that impacts people's lives, because I know that it certainly has impacted mine. And when it was evident that we needed to take social distancing very seriously, I thought of how that was going to affect people who rely on community resources and support, including the elderly. And so we know that the elderly were an extremely vulnerable population health-wise when it comes to COVID-19, but we also know that they're heavily affected by loneliness, and loneliness can lead to even poorer health outcomes. So at that time, everything had moved online for me. My classes were virtual, my meetings were virtual, and I felt kind of helpless, and I was sitting at home and I wanted to help. And when I learned that senior living facilities were restricting their visitation policies in order to protect their residents, I wondered if they would be open to me just giving their residents a phone call. And then I thought, well, if I'm one student sitting at home feeling this way, I wonder if other students feel this way too. So I sent out an email and I got an overwhelmingly positive response that students just wanted to help. They wanted to do something. And that was how the Phone a Friend program was born. Students sign up to call a senior resident for 30 minutes every day, and that is our only requirement. So currently we have 120 UNC students signed up from across all different programs. We are partnered with Brookdale Living Facilities, who has 700 locations across the country, and we are targeting the areas hit hardest by COVID-19 currently. And we just started matching last week. We had our official launch, and we have 13 student and senior matches. And I received an email from Alex Brandwine. He's an MBA candidate. He's also a former Adams apprentice, and he's founder of Brandwine's Bagels. And he was speaking to me about his conversation with his senior, the first one that he had. And I just wanted to share a little bit of that information with you. So his senior lives in Florida. Florida is the state with the 7th highest number of cases in the country right now. And so he was telling me about his first call with his senior and that it went on for an hour. He said they had great conversation and was already learning a few things about a man with a lot of amazing experiences. So unbeknownst to me, when I was matching them up, they are both New Yorkers. His senior grew up outside of the city in Long Island, and Alex grew up outside of the city in Westchester. His senior also happens to have an MBA and went to undergrad and grad school at Dartmouth. No big deal, says Alex. His senior is 89 years old and says that he is definitely feeling confined. He says that there are no activities anymore. He has food delivered to his room 3 times a day. He has family that can come visit, but he says that he really enjoyed being on the phone with Alex and was eager to have more calls and learn about his background and his family and career. And so I think the Phone a Friend program really highlights how eager our students are willing to help. and how much they really want to care for and connect with the senior population. Everyone is affected by isolation. It's human nature to want to be connected, to lift each other up, and to see and be seen. And that goes for any age. So I think that the most important thing we can do in a time like this is to stay connected and support each other. We have to remember that we're all a community and we're all a family. And this pandemic is going to show us the inequities in our society, but we can always do our part by maintaining, nurturing, and growing relationships, even if they aren't the ones that we had before. And maybe in times like this, especially if they aren't the ones that we had before. And sometimes we can just go back to the basics for that connection. It doesn't have to be, one-on-one time at a restaurant. It can be a 30-minute phone call when you're isolated at home. And I think that's a very beautiful and wonderful thing that can give us hope and bring us together in a time that can be very lonely and isolating. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Diana, for sharing that powerful story. At this point, I want to thank all of our panelists for sharing their research and their work to address this crisis in such creative ways. And kick off Q&A. Our first question comes from Nik Mille, a reporter for Courthouse News. He says, I'm interested in the experts' thoughts about the SBA's $350 billion loan program rollout. I've heard that many offering the loans to non-established customers are newer small businesses and entrepreneurs being. I don't know if this is a question that Ted, Mahka, I'm not sure who would like to kick things off with this one, but I'll open it to the group.
Yeah.
Oh, and remember that you're muted.
This is Ted Zoller. Very challenging scenario. I take it that there is kind of some questions around how the stimulus package is going to actually support small business, but with a specific focus on companies that may be pre-revenue or startups. And will, the startup rate actually decline during this period. There's no question that the policies that are put in place in the SBA loan programs are designed toward entities that are already employing people, and their qualification criteria in the form of loans, even if they're not collateralized, still favors existing enterprises. Whereas NewCo, a term of art we use to talk about early stage companies, oftentimes don't have the kind of record that would be ultimately diligenced in a way that could be suitable for a loan. I think that the administration's aware of that issue now. I know the SBA is trying to think of ways to help address the pre-revenue companies and the companies at the very early stage that might be financed through bootstrapping or through early stage angel capital. But in most cases, there's not a very good solution in place for those types of companies. It is such a widespread issue when you look at all of the deployment of the loan programs across the board, just handling cash flow requirements for payroll. We've looked at some of the scenarios that have been unfolding in some of the European countries, how Sweden has focused on it, Denmark, Austria. And we're thinking there might be new solutions put in place in the second wave of stimulus that we'll obviously need to have for these types of companies. I know the banks are going through a lot of trouble in implementing the current policies, but I'm thinking many of these things will get worked out for existing enterprises. But the reporter is adept to see the paucity of solutions for early stage companies. And I do think it will be a substantial impact.
Excellent, great. We have another question in from Seth Gullidge at the TBJ. He says this is really for anyone, but possibly most pertinent to you, Ted. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the entrepreneurial landscape, both during and immediately after the pandemic, in relation to access to venture capital and seed investors. Do you think that global uncertainty will make it more challenging to raise funding for those innovators and the inventors we've discussed? And if so, what are some potential solutions? Yeah,
it's an interesting question. We've faced this before. obviously in time of a down market, equity doesn't flow as readily. You've got to realize there are two impacts of this type of crisis. One is that valuations, enterprise valuations, will drop. So you'll see opportunities for companies to combine and for M&A activity to occur. And you'll find that investors will be looking for opportunities that they may not have had when the valuations were higher. The unfortunate side is money that was already committed in the market is now taken such a substantial hit that it's created kind of a conservative posture among equity investors. And equity investors are the first ones, especially at the early stage, to pull back in their investing activities. So I do think that angel investing and venture capital investing will reduce over the next 2 quarters. I think that what you'll find is that in a given portfolio company, a venture capital portfolio company, they'll reserve upwards to 2/3 of their capital as dry powder for substantial investments in existing portfolio companies. So they're going to try to focus on doubling down on the companies that are showing progress. They'll continue to invest in those companies to make sure that they survive through this process. And I'm thinking that's the story that we'll start to see, is a consolidation of capital going to supporting companies to survive through this crisis. But I do think the reporter's correct in seeing that early stage capital will be under some distress as investors become a little bit more conservative. I can't think of many solutions other than helping entrepreneurs transition to slow their burn rates, to reduce their needs for equity during this period of time. I know that many companies are slowing their efforts to just make it through this period. I think that the SBA will come up with solutions to encourage equity investments to continue. And I know the Angel Capital Association is directly involved in attempting to find a solution for tax credits, for instance, for equity investors that are prepared to write checks during this difficult time.
Great, thank you.
May I add something to Ted's great points with respect to Seth's question? I think Ted had great points with respect to how the financial dimensions of venture capital will react or probably bounce back after the crisis is over. I think another dimension to consider is that maybe the criteria to evaluate some of these entrepreneurial businesses may also change. So a startup that otherwise had a pretty high chance of receiving venture capital or angel support previous to this, let's say last January, February, may no longer have that much of a chance moving forward, given that some of the changes that we're seeing in how customers react to certain types of businesses, let's say toward outside entertainment, toward the sharing economy, may have long-lasting effects. So the next Uber of things, the next WeWork will face more challenges relative to other businesses whose activities at the moment are not disrupted so much by the crisis.
One thing I might add too, Mahka, that's an excellent point. After the last shock in 2009, the leading market in venture capital, according to NVCA, which is the National Venture Capital Association, was healthcare. So in 2010 through 2015, roughly, healthcare was the leading market. And then from 2016 to 2019, it went back to tech. I think you're going to see a reversion back to healthcare as the leading market for the certainly next 3 quarters to 4 quarters. And I do think that there will be a rebound because valuations are going to be adjusted given this crisis. And you're going to see opportunities for investing in situations where they weren't available before because valuations were at a record high prior to the crisis. So I'm not pessimistic about the future of equity investing. As a matter of fact, I think there'll be a whipsaw effect and a rebound after the crisis dissipates. There's a lot of capital on the sidelines. There's a lot of liquidity out there. And I think it's looking for investable opportunities. And I think everyone's going to be looking to reinvest as soon as the crisis is well defined.
So we have another question from Sue that I'll take. Sue has asked whether some of these individuals at companies that Ted and I talked in our opening remarks, who are collaborating with each other, who have started initiatives to tackle some of the challenges, are they really qualified? Could there possibly be harms in activation and involvement of some of these individuals and companies who do not have appropriate qualifications? So, Sue, my reaction to your question is that I think the biggest challenge we are facing is that we don't know what is it that we don't know. And given this uncertainty, given this unknown landscape, it is hard to evaluate and look at and say, hey, I have the qualification, you don't have the qualification. So let's take a look back at the Ebola crisis. So when Ebola started and was rapidly disseminating, people assumed that this is the realm of infectious disease specialists to really comment and identify the sources and solutions to the disease. It was only after a couple of months that they realized that Ebola virus really locate in people's eyes. And as a result of that, investments and knowledge of ophthalmologists were really critical for finding a solution, a vaccine, and a cure. And this was something that came as a result of collaboration and involvement of multiple actors. So imagine a scenario if under that circumstances, we would have said that, hey, this is not an eye doctor, an ophthalmologist should not join the conversation. We would have lost huge opportunities and solutions. So that's my broad answer, that within different dimensions of healthcare, different expertise with respect to methods of production. Is it going to be RNA techniques, or is it going to be production of vaccines, the old format in eggs? We don't know it. So that's why we need diversity of actors who come with their prior knowledge, with really different and diverse backgrounds, to experiment and really find the map to that landscape that we have no clue how it's going to look like. And yes, inappropriate, unscientific claims will hurt a way, but those people should share ideas, and then the scientific criteria will rule them out, and eventually in the solution will converge into something that addresses that potential demand. So that's the way I think about it.
I might be reading too much into the question, but certainly one of the key issues is many of the companies have been positioned to take advantage of global supply chains, and this crisis has exposed vulnerabilities, which has drawn companies into doing things like production functions that would otherwise have been in Southeast Asia back onshore. It's quite exciting to me, because that's a trend that was already happening before the crisis. I think it's accelerating the crisis. Rich actually discussed that in his comments. I was overjoyed last night when I went to Lowe's and was able to acquire some paper towels. I still am puzzled why we're having trouble with toilet paper and paper towels, because I'm pretty confident that production is pretty localized. But when it comes to integrated technology companies, most of them are taking full advantage of global supply chains, not only on the physical side, but on the labor side as well. And this crisis has exposed certain vulnerabilities, which means I think a new aperture is going to be viewed by entrepreneurs to ensure that they can fill in and have contingencies in the event there are interruptions like what COVID has precipitated. Rich, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, so we've seen a lot of this, a lot of these issues firsthand in our enterprise. Everything from 3D printing, which is kind of a darling of innovation and is fantastic for generating prototypes. It has some applications in large-scale manufacturing, but it also has limitations. And when you start getting a community that want to help out with technologies with something like 3D printing, I'm just using that as an example. If you had a company, you'd have quality control processes in place for individual parts as well as wholly fabricated assemblies. When you start distributing those functions, quality control becomes extremely difficult to navigate. And when you're talking about introducing equipment into a healthcare setting, which has very tight regulatory requirements, it's almost impossible. Even when you look at homemade personal protection equipment like face masks, you don't know whether someone who produced that was an asymptomatic shedder. So within our own production facility, which it's literally the entry hallway for the library downstairs in Mary Hall, but for our volunteer corps that we are bringing together to produce these face shields, they go through a 20-part questionnaire which asks them about their health for the last 2 weeks. And then we vet their health on coming into the facility that we have set up, and we navigate their processes with face masks and how they're manipulating and cleaning the equipment as we produce it. If you take homemade gear, you have no control over any of those health processes coming in and contamination processes. So it's been an extraordinary challenge. There's no guidelines for this. We're making this up as we go along. And I think it's going to be really important to work on this coming out of this crisis in understanding what kinds of flexible guidelines can we establish for the use of the community in mobilizing for a crisis like this, and in which cases can we make use of equipment from the community, in which cases it's just not going to work.
We actually have another question. This one is for Diana. Can you elaborate a bit on how Phone a Friend is matching students and seniors? The person who submitted it is a researcher who says it sounds like the people you gave as an example were very, is there a vetting, or how do you do this combination?
Yeah, great question. Thank you to whoever asked that. Our students send me an email, and it includes their name, their phone number, and 3 hobbies or interests. And the program directors at each living facility do the same for their residents if they want to participate. And based off that, I do my best to match up students and seniors who have some common ground. And the students also receive a guidance document with conversation starters, some resources for older adults, and just a reiteration of what is and is not their job as a Phone a Friend volunteer. And so we found that, for the most part, they have something to talk about, common interests or hobbies. But like you heard in Alex's story, I can't capture everything. And so they usually find common ground in other ways also.
That's fantastic. Thank you for sharing more about that story. And I'm very excited to get that update. We have a question from another researcher asking, I think this probably would be best for Mahka, looking forward, what industries permanently up in crisis and how do you see them adapting?
So great question. So this goes back, I think, a little bit to the third category of innovations that I was talking about, in the sense that the shift in supply and demand these days have been dramatic. All of us, with our staying home, we have changed which businesses we draw on and rely on a frequent basis or not. For some of these being retail services, entertainment, food and restaurants, they are adversely affected at this moment. But once the social distancing guidelines are over, many of these businesses will go back to their operations. That being said, a good number of them have had this time, these couple of months, to think about ways in which they were running their businesses. And some of those innovations will outlast the crisis. So let me give you an example, a very simple one with food. So a lot of like restaurants that are still open, but will continue to have food deliveries moving forward, are now live streaming their kitchen for people to see that, hey, these are all the hygiene practices we're involved in. This is the exact like movement of one piece of ingredient in our kitchen to the next, and you can follow that. Once they establish these routines in place, even after social distancing guidelines are over, that will have implications. Those innovations will stay with them, because it could be the case that they realize, here, our customers really want this. This is really make us much more efficient. And even though we see those businesses still be in place, the internal operations, what you're doing behind the scenes, will be different. We can extend this and think about retail as well as entertainment services as well. So these are industries that have been adversely affected and will see hopefully subsequent innovations. There are going to be industries, as I mentioned earlier, with respect to anything that's offering services virtually and while you're at home, that has seen an immense uptake with respect to its demand. And if we think about ourselves as like typical customers, let's say think about a product that came out like 5-6 years ago, vacuum cleaner robots. Not many people purchased it at the beginning. So that was an area of, if somebody really had special needs or always wanted to have cool gadgets at home and work with them, they went and purchased it. And over time, in the next 6 or 7 years, a lot of other people in the US population realized that, hey, this product is useful, maybe I'll buy and try it. Some others waited for the price of those products to become much cheaper before buying one for that of Black Friday sales to come. And that like process of customer adoption of, let's say, the vacuum cleaners that I was talking about took 6 to 7 years. Now that adoption process is accelerated for online education, for home entertainment, for even like home exercise, so that you watch your Zumba class and yoga class over Zoom, over internet. So that condensation of those time periods is going to change the innovation landscape in those industries for long term.
I would underscore one thing in Mahka's comment that I think is interesting. There's a silver lining effect clearly in education. And while everyone was shocked by bringing their courses online over the last 4 weeks, believe me, I've gone through, as all the faculty have at UNC, an incredible transition. The opportunities to define new ways to adapt pedagogy and education, I think is perhaps a new normal. It will have a tremendous effect on K through 12 and higher education. And UNC was in a really strong position to make the transition. I'd give a shout out to our dean, Doug Shackelford, who's led the development of our MBA at UNC offering, which is an online offering, which is now the largest and top ranked MBA program, as an example. So many of the faculty were already pretty accustomed to teaching online. I think, though, I'm seeing innovations left and right in education as a consequence of the COVID crisis, and we've accelerated that learning in the market. And I believe that we've updated ourselves a bit. So it was almost like a reboot with COVID, and we'll come out of this in a very different form. I think the story to watch is how higher ed will be transformed as a consequence of us now being exposed to online learning across the board.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mahka, and thank you, Ted. Our next question is for you, Rich. In the global supply chain issues, how is your group able to source the materials needed for the production of PPE?
I think obtaining the materials to fabricate our PPE has taken at least 50% of our time. And basically, this has come down to understanding North Carolina manufacturing bases. We have standard suppliers that we order from, but we have not known those people on a first name basis. We now do know those people on a first name basis. And we've had to chase within the supply chain the people who supply the local suppliers and distributors back to the original factories that are producing the raw materials for the products we buy. So it's been an educational process in following the supply chain back. But the story, the further, as you start moving outside of North Carolina, the story has universally been the same. We're competing against every state in the country for the same materials. And we have been challenged to purchase as fast as possible the most material we could afford and to our maximum expectation of need. If you imagine that every state across the country, every university that is supporting a health system is doing the exact same thing, this has put a crush nationally and internationally on the supply chain. If instead there was coordination where people could make reasonable orders for reasonable expectations of need, then we wouldn't be competing and there'd be less chaos in the supply chain. So basically, it's been the groups, the universities that have moved quickest and fastest and with the most resources to secure the supply chain. But it's been a continuing challenge, and hopefully as we move past this, we'll become better coordinated at the state and the national level so that we won't have this again.
That's great, Rich. Thank you. And a follow-up question from that is also, where is the funding coming from for the work that you're doing? Is it university funds that you're leveraging, or are there private donors engaged? How is that being handled?
Yeah, so the primary funding for our work is coming from the UNC health system, but we've also had donations from private organizations. For example, I'll put a shout out to the Rotary Club that has given us a substantial donation for our work, and we continue to see other private giving that comes in. Fantastic.
That's wonderful. Well, I know we are just about at time here. I want to thank all of our panelists so much for participation today and for sharing those inspiring stories. This conversation has been very refreshing for me, as I hope it has been for all of our participants. I know we have to answer all questions, so if you didn't get your question answered, feel free to follow up with me by email after this webinar ends, and I'll be happy to connect you with the right experts to get some quotes from. Thank you again for participating. Like I said, this is a series of free things we're offering. We'll be doing this next week, so mark your calendars. Tuesdays at 11 a.m. You'll, of course, get an email from me reminding you of that and giving you more details on Monday morning. But hope to see you next week. And until then, take good care and be safe. And we'll talk with you soon.